All right, get ready for a deep dive, everybody, because this one is a roller coaster. We're tackling the Rebecca Zahau case, and trust me, it's a wild ride. We're talking about a mysterious death at a luxury mansion back in 2011. And the details, well, let's just say they'll leave you with more questions than answers. But hey, that's what we're here for, right? We're going to break it all down using some excerpts from a pretty detailed account of the case, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to form your own opinion about what went down.
You know, what's always gotten to people about this case, the thing that just sticks with you, it's that sharp contrast we see. On one hand, you have this picture-perfect mansion in Coronado, California, like the kind of place you dream about, right? And then on the other hand, you have this darkness that unfolds there, this really tragic death. It makes you wonder, if these beautiful places, if they can, like, hold on to secrets.
It's true. The mansion itself almost becomes a character in this whole thing, doesn't it? And then there's Rebecca, this woman with an incredibly fascinating past. I mean, imagine that she was born into a tribe in Myanmar, had to escape political turmoil with her family. And get this, by the time she ends up living this life of luxury with her millionaire boyfriend, she's fluent in 6 languages. Talk about resilience. But there's also this underlying fear of financial instability that she carried with her, something from her childhood.
And you're right to highlight that because that fear, that deep-seated need she had for security, well, it becomes a key factor as we unravel the events that followed.
Okay, so fast forward to July 2011. This idyllic mansion, this place of beauty, suddenly becomes the scene of a horrific tragedy. Jonah Shacknai's 6-year-old son, Max, is found badly injured after falling from a balcony. I mean, talk about a parent's worst nightmare.
And it's a nightmare made even more terrifying by the fact that it's surrounded by, well, ambiguity. There's whispers and rumors about a razor scooter, a broken chandelier, but here's the thing. No one actually saw Max fall. Even the experts, the ones who came in to try and make sense of how it physically happened, they couldn't even agree if it was just a freak accident or something more.
It's like this big question mark just hangs over the entire case from that point on. We have these conflicting stories from the people who were at the mansion that day, and then this unsettling feeling that something just doesn't add up.
And believe me, that unease you're talking about, it definitely intensifies when, just 2 days later, Rebecca is found dead. On the mansion grounds, no less.
Hanging from that balcony, it's a disturbing image.
Yeah, it is. And the specifics of how they found her, those are the things that really get under your skin.
Right, like what exactly did they find?
So Rebecca, she was partially dressed when they found her, and she had been gagged. Not only that, her hands, her feet, they were bound.
Okay, so that right there, that's not screaming suicide, is it?
No, not really. And get this, even the knots they used on her, those weren't just your everyday knots. They were, how did they describe them? Oh, right. Complex nautical knots, the kind of stuff you'd see a sailor using,
And don't forget about that message they found, the one painted on the door. She saved him, can you save her? It's like something out of a movie, like a creepy thriller or something.
Totally. And, if you add on top of all that, the fact that a neighbor actually reported hearing a scream that night, it really starts to feel like something else is going on. But here's the thing. We can't ignore the official findings either. Officially, the cause of death. Suicide by hanging.
Suicide. But with all those other details, how did they come to that conclusion?
Well, Dr. Lucas, the forensic pathologist, he pointed to a few things. For one, Rebecca's injuries, they did line up with a fall. Plus, there was the petechiae, those tiny blood spots you often see in asphyxiation cases. So on the surface, it looked like a pretty open and shut case.
But I'm guessing it wasn't that simple.
You got it. See, they brought in another expert, Dr. Bex, to do a second autopsy. And he wasn't so sure about the suicide ruling.
Really? Why not?
He thought there was a chance, based on his examination, that Rebecca might have died from strangulation, not hanging.
Oh, wow, that changes things.
It really does. Dr. Betts, he pointed out signs of a possible struggle, and he also questioned where the, what do they call, post-mortem stains, how those were on her body. So this is where things get really interesting. Even in forensics, it's not always black and white. You have 2 experts both looking at the same evidence, and they come up with different conclusions.
It makes you wonder, how often does that happen? Different interpretations, changing the entire course of a case.
All the time, unfortunately. And to make things even more complicated in this case, a lot of the physical evidence we have, it almost seems to contradict itself.
What do you mean?
For example, they found dirt on Rebecca's feet. Dirt that matched the dirt on the balcony. Which, seems to back up the idea that she fell from there, right?
Sure, makes sense. But there's more to it, isn't there?
Oh, there's always more to it. See, the thing is, besides Rebecca's footprints and the footprints of the first officer who arrived, there were no other footprints on that balcony.
Hold on. No one else's. Not even Jonah's.
Nope, not a single one. And then you've got the rope.
The rope she was found hanging from.
That's the one. No fingerprints.
None at all.
Not even Rebecca's own fingerprints were on that rope.
You'd think if she'd hung herself, her prints would be there.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, you've got the different opinions from the people who were closest to her.
Right, like Rebecca's family. Didn't they completely disagree with Jonah's theory?
Oh, absolutely. Remember how Jonah suggested that maybe because of some Asian concept of honor, Rebecca might have taken her own life? Rebecca's family was completely opposed to that idea.
Yeah, I remember. They insisted she would never do such a thing.
And that's where this case gets even more complex, you see. You have these clashing cultural perspectives, all this emotion surrounding Max's accident. It becomes really tough to separate what's factual from what's speculation, what's cultural understanding, and what might be personal bias. And then, just when you think it can't get any more convoluted, you have this civil lawsuit.
Right, the one Rebecca's family filed against Jonah's brother, Adam Shacknai. And the jury sided with the Zahau family, right?
Yeah, they did. But it's important to remember that a civil case, it's not the same as a criminal one. The burden of proof, it's different. So while that jury's decision about Adam, it carries weight, it doesn't automatically equal guilt in, the eyes of the law.
Okay, that's a really important distinction to make. So we have this verdict, but we're still left grappling with all these unanswered questions about what happened to Rebecca.
Exactly. And honestly, that's a big part of why this case still fascinates people. It's like we're staring at a half-finished puzzle. We can kind of see the picture it's trying to paint, but will we ever have all the pieces? Who knows?
It's almost like the official ruling of suicide. Even though it provides a sort of resolution, it doesn't quite sit right when you consider everything else. Like, what about that message, the one painted on the door? Was that a genuine cry for help, or was it staged, like a red herring to throw investigators off?
And then there's that scream, the one the neighbor mentioned hearing. Could that have been connected to Rebecca's death somehow? Or was it just a creepy coincidence, adding to the already unsettling vibe of that night?
It makes you think, especially with all the other factors like the wealth, the privilege, the potential for hidden truths. It makes you wonder if the whole story, the complete picture, is something we'll never truly get to see.
We may never know for sure, and that's part of what makes this case so captivating. It forces us to confront the limits of what we can know, and to grapple with the possibility that some mysteries, well, they might just stay unsolved.
So here we are, right back to where we started. We've gone through the details, the evidence, the differing viewpoints, and, it really makes you think, was Rebecca Zahau's death a tragic suicide, or did something more sinister unfold in that seaside mansion? Whatever you believe, I think the biggest takeaway here is that sometimes the pursuit of truth, that journey, is just as important as finding the actual answers. Okay, so this deep dive, it's about this case from South Korea. And wow, it's one of those stories, that just really stays with you. We're talking about Choi, a 14-year-old girl. And she was failed by pretty much everyone and everything that should have protected her. And maybe the worst part is this isn't some isolated thing, this case. It really reveals some seriously messed up stuff that's way too common.
Yeah, what really gets me about this case is how it just throws everything out in the open. You see the power dynamics, the corruption. You really get a glimpse into what South Korean society was like back then. It's a brutal reminder. Like, sometimes the things we should fear most aren't hiding in the dark. They're right there in plain sight, protected by money and people just looking the other way.
Right, it all starts with like this wrong number, like something out of a movie. Choi calls this boy Park. And they actually become friends. Sounds innocent, right?
And this is where technology, like the internet, it's a double-edged sword, It can be great for connecting with people, but it can also be a path to something truly awful. And for Choi, well, that's exactly what it was.
So Park invites Choi to his place in Miryang, and this is where it all goes really wrong. Park and 10 other boys with him attack Choi. He hits her with an iron pipe. She loses consciousness. It's just awful to even think about, but I think it's important that we really try to understand the level of violence that was used against her.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing. They held her captive. Months. Yeah. Months of just horrible abuse. And they filmed it, too. Using that to control her, it just shows they had zero remorse, like they thought they could do whatever they wanted with no consequences.
It's just unthinkable. They raped her over and over, sometimes up to 24 of them at once. And they used those videos, threatened to release them to keep her quiet. This was calculated cruelty. And the thing is, this all happened during a time when South Korea was dealing with a huge surge in youth gang violence in the early 2000s.
Exactly. This wasn't some outlier. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem. Gang violence was rising. Nobody was talking about it. And it often allowed these guys, especially if they came from wealthy families, to get away with anything. Sadly, we've seen this happen again and again throughout history.
And if that wasn't bad enough, home wasn't any better for Choi. Just imagine going through something like that and then coming home to even more violence. Her dad, he was an alcoholic and abusive to both Choi and her mother. Her mom eventually left, and she left the kids behind.
It just breaks your heart. You know, Choi's story, it's the story of so many victims out there. Suffering in silence. They're trapped. The system fails them. Their own homes are dangerous. They have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. This is why having a safety net, a good support system, is so important.
It's just awful. She was completely alone, months of this abuse. And finally, Choi tries to take her own life. That's how bad it was. And tragically, it's that attempt, that act of desperation that finally brings the truth out. She's in the hospital and confides in her aunt, who goes to the police. And you'd think, finally, this is where things change, where the system does its job, right?
You'd like to think so. But sadly, no. And that's where this case takes another heartbreaking turn. The system, the corruption, it all comes crashing down on Choi, and she's the one who suffers.
You have this girl, I mean, she's been through so much, and finally she speaks out. You think someone would listen, right? You think the people who are supposed to help would actually do something.
It's heartbreaking. You'd really hope so.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't happen that way. The people who are supposed to uphold justice, to protect her, they just make things worse. That's just how power and influence work, you know?
The police investigation was a joke, seriously. They actually tried to get Choi's aunt to just drop the whole thing. And get this, they leaked information about the case, putting Choi and her family in even more danger. It's unbelievable.
Right. It makes you question everything. Why would the police, who are supposed to protect people, why would they act like that? It's simple and it's scary. Corruption. These boys, they came from money. Powerful families. Families who could do whatever they wanted and get away with it.
There was even a story about one police officer, publicly humiliating Choi. He told people at a cafe not to serve her, called her that dirty girl. It caused a huge uproar, and eventually that officer and some others, they were found guilty, but just of negligence.
And that just shows you, even when they get caught, it's just a slap on the wrist. This case, it's a clear example of how the system protects its own, even when they do terrible things.
It makes you sick. But it gets worse. There was so much evidence, and still most of those boys, they walked free, their family's money and connections. It was like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. Two systems of justice. One for the rich and powerful, and one for everyone else. And for Choi, well, she never stood a chance. The system that should have protected her, it just turned on her.
And then her own father. This is almost impossible to believe. He actually took money from those families to drop the charges against them. How do you even process that? To sell out your own child who's already been through hell for money.
It's devastating. But you have to try to understand the desperation, the pressure he must have felt. It's not right, not at all, but it makes you think about the bigger picture.
Choi had nobody. No one to protect her, no one to fight for her. She couldn't finish school, couldn't find a decent job, haunted by what happened. It just breaks your heart.
And the saddest part, her story, it's not unique. It happens every day. People, especially those who are already vulnerable, they get abused by the system that's supposed to protect them. It's a reminder that we need real change, a justice system that actually works for everyone.
It's a bleak picture, that's for sure. But there's a twist. Years later, a YouTuber decides to do some digging. And what he finds, well, it changes everything.
That's where things get interesting. It shows how technology, social media, it can be used to fight for justice. This blogger, he saw that the system had failed and he wanted to do something about it.
He starts investigating, figures out who some of these guys are, finds out where they work, their families, everything. It was a risky move, for sure.
Oh, it was. He was putting himself out there, no doubt. But it worked. People were outraged. They had been quiet for years, and now they had a voice.
It's true. And the thing is, these guys, they thought they'd gotten away with it. They had families, jobs, normal lives. Then suddenly, bam, everyone knows what they did.
And they paid the price.
Right.
One of them, he was running a restaurant. Family business, I think? It was over. Bad reviews, protests, the whole 9 yards. He had to shut it down.
It shows you the power of, well, people power. Social media, it can be a dangerous tool, but in this case, it held these guys accountable when the courts couldn't.
For sure. It's like, we always want justice, right?
Yeah.
But When the system fails, people will find another way. This case, it's like a perfect example of how that's changing in the digital age. It's not always pretty, but it's there.
Another one of those guys, he lost his job at a Volvo dealership because of all the backlash. Nobody wanted to let these guys get away with what they did.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what justice really means. It's not always about jail time.
Right.
Sometimes it's about owning up to what you did and facing the consequences, even if it takes years.
So where does that leave us? Choi, her life was shattered. The system that was supposed to protect her, it completely failed. And these men, yeah, they didn't go to jail, but they couldn't hide forever.
Exactly. It's complicated. We want justice, but it's not always that simple. And when it comes to cases like this, well, we all have a role to play.
It makes you think, you know. When we see something wrong, do we look the other way or do we actually do something about it? And if we do, how do we do it right? These aren't easy questions to answer.
No, they're not. But they're questions we have to ask ourselves. We can't just rely on other people to fix things. We have to be a part of it. We need to demand better from the system, from each other. Choi's story, it's a reminder that we have to fight for justice, always.
It's a powerful message, and I hope our listeners are listening. If you're as moved by the story as we are, keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts. Let's talk about it.
Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Let's talk about Yoka Temple in Japan.
Ooh, okay.
This temple, right, it's got this reputation for like protecting children, which is sweet.
Right.
But then summer of 77, things get a little strange.
Okay.
So we're going to look at, like, is this just folklore,
Yeah.
mixing with a real tragedy? Or is there something more, like spooky more?
Right, yeah. What makes Yamboxa so interesting is that the beliefs there, they're so strong in the community. Parents have always looked to this temple for protection, you know?
Yeah.
So when these rumors pop up about this strange woman hanging around,
Oh, see, that's already creepy.
it just hit this nerve, you know?
Yeah.
It messed with something already there.
Okay, so paint the picture. Late at night,
Uh-huh.
it's summer, so it's
Yeah.
hot, sticky, and people driving by the temple, they start seeing this figure.
Okay.
A woman, always in a thick black sweater, hunched over, almost like she's carrying something heavy.
And you know what, summer in Japan, that sweater detail, that is creepy. It's
Yeah.
those little things that just throw you off, make you wonder.
Totally. Like a glitch in the matrix, something's not right. We even have a taxi driver, right? He sees this woman. And
Oh, wow.
he gets this feeling like he should stop.
Really?
Maybe she needs help.
But
Something about her, that sweater, is just off.
and you got to listen to that gut feeling, right? It's like your brain picking up on danger signals your eyes miss.
Exactly. So he keeps driving, but glances in the rearview mirror, and poof, gone.
What? No.
Vanished. No side streets, nowhere to hide. She just disappears.
That's so eerie. That's like a classic ghost story thing, right?
Right. It messes with your head.
Yeah.
But then
That's laser.
another driver, same thing, the woman. But this time,
Uh-oh.
when she looks up, her face,
Ah.
messed up, disfigured.
Yeah.
And that's how the legend of the ghostly woman of Yamboxa is born. And then it gets even weirder.
Weirder. How?
So someone finds a heavy stone,
Okay.
like right there in the temple grounds.
In the temple.
And get this, it's got these words scrawled on it. There's a ghost here.
Oh, come on. Seriously. There's a ghost here. Who does that?
Right. But it gets creepier. The caretaker, they kept finding the stone in different places, like someone was moving it on purpose.
Man, that's just wrong. Especially with everything else going on in those stories. I wouldn't even want to touch that stone.
And it's like, those words, they were a warning. See, on December 7th, firefighters are doing a routine check of this reservoir nearby.
Routine check, right?
And they find, well, it's awful. A body.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so decomposed, they could barely tell who it was.
That's just tragic.
And this is where things go from spooky to heartbreaking. They finally ID the body. It was a young woman, Amiko, 21 years old. She'd been reported missing weeks earlier.
21. That's so young.
And get this, she was wearing,
Oh,
wait
yeah.
for it, that black sweater.
No way.
The same one from the ghost stories.
You're kidding. So all those people, they weren't seeing a ghost. They were seeing...
A real person in terrible trouble, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that behind every creepy story, there's often a very real, very sad human element.
Absolutely. So who is this Amiko?
Well, she was young, only 21, and she was pregnant when she disappeared. There were rumors that she wanted to get married, but her boyfriend, he wasn't into it.
And back then, the pressure on young women, it was intense. That refusal could have been devastating.
3 days after they found Amiko, the police arrested her boyfriend. He confessed. Case closed. But here's the thing that gets me. Knowing what happened to Amiko, knowing it was HRR in that black sweater, does it change how we see those ghost sightings?
Right. Like, were those just spooky stories? Or was that Amiko reaching out trying to tell us something?
It's a scary thought. But it gets even wilder. Years later, in 2004, this paranormal researcher named Koike Takeko, he gets interested in the case. So Koike, he wants to see where Amiko lived, right? Get a feel for her life.
Makes sense.
Plugs her address into his GPS, but here's the thing.
Uh-oh, this sounds bad.
Instead of her house, the GPS, it takes him to the cemetery.
No way, her grave.
Her grave, and not even, like, nearby. We're talking over 500 meters off.
That's just wrong. GPS is supposed to be accurate, right?
Yeah.
What are the odds?
Right, like a wrong turn. Okay, but this is specific, intentional almost.
So creepy. Makes you think. Was it trying to tell him something? Lead him there on purpose?
And hold on, it gets weirder. A Japanese TV crew, they hear about this, right? They're like, let's try this. Different GPS, everything.
No way they got the same result.
They go to Amiko's old address, boom, redirected to her grave. And it gets even more specific. At one point, they should have turned left towards the house, but the GPS told them to turn right. Right towards the cemetery?
Oh, come on. That's not a coincidence. Something's messing with them, right? Like targeting them somehow.
And get this. The GPS company, they swore up and down. No malfunctions. Both devices were working perfectly.
Okay, now we're in Twilight Zone territory. What could even explain that?
Right. It's like something out of a horror movie, but it actually happened. But remember earlier, we were talking about how Amiko's body was found and how some parts were missing.
Yeah, it was rough. Because of how long she was out there, they never found everything.
And there's this theory, and again, I got to stress, this is just a theory, that maybe Amiko's spirit, it was drawn back to the area.
Drawn back? You mean like to look for what was missing?
Exactly. Like her spirit was incomplete, so it was trying to, I don't know, put itself back together.
Yeah.
And maybe those GPS things, maybe that was her way of leading people to her.
That's both sad and terrifying at the same time. It really makes you think about what happens to us after, you know?
It does make you think. We started with these spooky stories, right? Ghost woman in a black sweater. But then we find out it's Amiko, a real woman with a tragic story. And then these GPS things happen that we can't even explain.
And that's the thing about this case, it sticks with you. Is it just a ghost story, or is it something even stranger, something we don't have the answers to?
Exactly. Some mysteries, they just stay mysteries, but they sure make you think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the haunting of Yoka Temple. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
All right, so today we're diving deep into a case that's both puzzling and tragic, the disappearance of Narumi Kurosaki. We've got court documents, news reports, the works, and we're ready to unpack it all for you.
Yeah, this one is fascinating. It really gets into the dark side of human nature, you know, how obsession and manipulation can twist love into something, well, dangerous.
Exactly. And the details, they're like something out of a movie. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to 2014, a university campus in Japan. Our story starts with Narumi Kurosaki, a dedicated student. Imagine waking up before the sun even thinks about rising, hitting the books, all to chase that dream of a top-tier university. That was Narumi.
Driven. And that kind of drive, that focus, it can attract certain personalities, people who see that dedication not as something to admire, but as a weakness to exploit.
And that's where Nicolas Sepeda comes in. Picture this. He's from a wealthy Chilean family, arrives in Japan on a scholarship, the whole charismatic foreigner thing. He sweeps Narumi off her feet, a whirlwind romance. But as we often see in these cases, those fairy tale beginnings, they can be deceptive.
Right. It's like that honeymoon phase glosses over some fundamental issues. And often those early signs of possessiveness, that need for control, they're there right from the start.
And it wasn't long before those red flags, they started popping up for Narumi. Even her mother, Taiko, she noticed them. Nicholas would get overly possessive, especially during a skiing trip where Narumi, she got lost for a bit. You know, a mother's intuition, it's a powerful thing.
Absolutely. Abusers, they thrive on isolation. They discourage independence, monitor their partner's interactions, all to maintain that control. It's a pattern, and it's insidious.
It's chilling. So, Narumi, ambitious as ever, decides to continue her studies in France. A natural next step, right?
Sure, for most people, it's exciting. New experiences, new people. But when you're dealing with a manipulative personality, that distance, it becomes a weapon.
The pressure must have been immense. Imagine you're a young student, you're finally abroad, and suddenly you're bombarded with messages questioning your every move, every friendship. That's what Narumi was dealing with. It gets worse. Nicholas, he even moved into her mother's house in Japan. Talk about inescapable.
Classic power play, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to box her in, make her feel guilty, dependent,
Yeah.
like she has no escape.
It's heartbreaking. On one hand, there's the memory of love, or at least the hope for it, but on the other, there's the suffocating control. And eventually, Narumi found the strength to break up with Nicholas.
Incredibly brave, but unfortunately, that's often when things escalate.
And escalate they did. Nicholas, he sends her this disturbing video. Instead of accepting the breakup, he gives her conditions for getting back together. The tone, it wasn't just sadness, it was menacing. And the plot thickens because remember those messages, the ones Narumi's mother Taiko received? Something about them just felt off.
That gut feeling, that instinct something isn't right. That's often the first clue for investigators in missing person cases.
It's like our intuition knows before our brains can catch up.
Exactly. And when you're looking at messages, emails, even social media posts, that feeling of off can be a major red flag. The way someone phrases things, their tone, it can all reveal inconsistencies.
Like a digital fingerprint, it can betray our true emotions, even when we try to hide them.
Precisely. And Taiko, she was adamant those messages, they didn't sound like Narumi. Those exclamation marks, certain phrases, it just felt wrong.
It's like a mother just knows. But while Taiko was struggling with this uneasiness, Nicholas, remember him, he decided to take a little unannounced trip to France.
And this is where those seemingly insignificant details, those small actions, they start to add up. Like, for instance, those purchases Nicholas made. Matches, kerosene, and get this, a heavy-duty degreaser. Now tell me, does that sound like your average packing list for a quick trip abroad?
It sounds more like a shopping list for, well, covering up a crime, doesn't it? It's like those crime shows. Suddenly, those everyday items take on a whole new meaning.
Exactly. And when you layer on top of that the GPS data recovered from Nicholas's rental car, it gets even more unsettling. We're talking about hours of driving around isolated forest roads. Not exactly the actions of someone just making a quick visit, right?
Definitely not. Especially when you consider his initial story was that he just saw Narumi briefly and then left France. So we've got conflicting stories, suspicious purchases, and now this damning GPS data. It's like a true crime novel, except this is real life. What other tools do investigators use to connect the dots in cases like this?
Witness testimony is crucial, those first-hand accounts. For instance, the students who reported seeing Nicholas at Narumi's dorm, or the couple who had dinner with them shortly before she vanished. Each sighting, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, adds another piece to the timeline. It helps investigators reconstruct the events leading up to the disappearance.
It's like a giant puzzle, each piece bringing the picture into focus a bit more.
Exactly. And let's not forget about digital footprints, those traces we leave online.
You mentioned earlier how revealing our digital activities can be.
Right. Think about it. The train ticket to Lyon, bought with Narumi's card, but used days after her last confirmed sighting. That speaks volumes. In today's world, it's almost impossible to disappear completely. We leave these digital breadcrumbs wherever we go.
It's a little unnerving when you think about it. So with all this circumstantial evidence piling up, the suspicious behavior, the conflicting statements, it all leads to Nicholas's trial. I can only imagine how tense that must have been. So the trial, it's like the climax of this whole story. What stood out to you? What was the strongest evidence the prosecution presented?
Well, remember those screams, the ones Narumi's neighbors in the dorm reported hearing?
Chilling, right?
Those screams, they became a chilling centerpiece of the case. I mean, with no other explanation for her sudden disappearance, it really painted a grim picture.
It definitely adds to the mystery.
And then there was the whole thing with Narumi's dorm room.
Yeah.
It was unusually tidy, almost staged, like someone was trying to erase any trace of their presence.
You mean like they wanted to make it look like she just vanished?
Exactly, like a perfect disappearing act. But the pieces weren't adding up. And then there's that train ticket, remember? The one to Lyon. Purchased with Narumi's card, but used days after she was last seen.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
The prosecution, they argued this was Nicholas trying to mislead everyone, a calculated move to create confusion about Narumi's whereabouts.
Wow, it's like he was creating a false trail, like something straight out of a crime show.
It really is. And let's not forget about Nicholas's trip to Spain immediately after Narumi disappeared. His cousin's testimony, the part about Nicholas asking about death by suffocation,
Yeah.
that was Well, let's just say it was a turning point in the case.
It's incredible how all these seemingly unrelated details, these breadcrumbs, they weave together into this really unsettling narrative. But even with all this circumstantial evidence, was the prosecution able to convince the jury? I mean, there was no body.
Right, that's the thing. The prosecution's theory was that Nicholas killed Narumi and then hid her body. But without a body, it becomes what they call a nobody homicide. It's not unheard of, but these cases, they are incredibly difficult to prove.
So how do you even begin to explain the lack of a body in a situation like this?
Well, in this case, there were two main theories presented. The first was that Narumi's body ended up in the Doubs River, the one that flows through Besançon. Makes sense geographically, and anyone who's familiar with rivers knows how hard it can be to recover a body from flowing water.
It's a sad thought, but it makes sense.
Right. And the second theory, well, this one's a bit more disturbing. There was speculation that Nicholas might have burned Narumi's body in one of those remote forest areas he was seen visiting. Remember those traces of dirt and grass found in the rental car?
Yeah, it's all coming back now.
The prosecution suggested that execution could be connected to disposing of a body. Of course, without any physical evidence, it was all just speculation.
It's hard to even imagine, but even if the jury believed one of these theories, how could they be absolutely sure without finding Narumi?
That's the heart of it, right? With nobody homicides, there's always that lingering uncertainty. And in this case, even with the conviction, the fact that Narumi's body was never found, it continues to fuel speculation. Some people still wonder if there's more to the story.
It's a tragic case, really makes you think. We started with a whirlwind romance, the kind that seems almost too good to be true, and it unravels into this dark tale of obsession, deceit, and ultimately a devastating loss.
Absolutely. And beyond the human drama, this case underscores just how important digital evidence has become in these investigations. GPS data, messages, even those online purchases we think nothing of, they can all become crucial clues.
It's like we leave a digital trail everywhere we go, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And those digital footprints, they can tell a story even when words fail.
It's a lot to process. If there's one thing we hope you take away from this deep dive, it's the importance of awareness, both in our relationships and in our digital lives. Pay attention to those red flags, trust your gut, and remember, even in the digital age, our actions have real-world consequences.
Well said. Until next time, stay vigilant and stay informed.